Welcome to the 2024 KBQ-TV Election Roundtable. So today we have an amazing panel of faculty from the UGRDB Political Science Department who will be giving an analysis on certain topics surrounding the election. So let me start presenting. Here we have on our side Professor Nicholas Kersey. Let's give a room. On this side, we have Assistant Professor and Pre-Law Advisor Andrew Smith. Here we have Lecturer Carlos Gutierrez Manix. He's our lecturer for the Political Science Department. And the others, on this side too, we have Lecturer Brian William Skoulos, right? Thank you so much. So let's start with the first question of the night, shall we? The first topic of discussion is economics. So let me ask you this. To what extent do economic issues such as inflation and job growth influence electors' priorities, and which candidate appears to be best equipped to address these concerns? The question is open for discussion. I don't know who wants to start first.
I think the economy has a big impact on how people vote and how people perceive candidates and who they're going to vote for in the next election. But I feel like one of the things of the current perceptions of the economy is that people are evaluating the economy using the current administration only, and kind of maybe forgetting a bit how the economy has been affected in the last year since the pandemic specifically. And even though the federal government has done a bit of work to make things better for the economy, these two candidates have very differing points of view, right? One of them, Harris, I think truly believes in the idea of supporting small businesses and getting people access to grants, and that's something that attracts voters. But something that also attracts voters is the idea of bringing back jobs to the U.S. and bringing back these nostalgic type of jobs that probably the U.S. had decades ago and have now left. And the other candidate, Donald Trump, is basically talking about tariffs, right? And using tariffs to bring back these jobs, make it harder for companies to leave. And if they do leave, they will be punished by tariffs. So they're very, very different. I think most of the economic experts would say tariffs are very bad for an economy in general. Although I think the way he's planning to do it is something that's probably unprecedented, and what Harris is saying or advocating for small business is something that's probably going to take a long time to impact the economy, but it would definitely help out in the long run.
So one of the things that you mentioned is nostalgia for an economy. This is one of the things that Trump ran on in 2016. Trump digs coal, and this time the former president is advocating for an increase in investment in oil and natural gas, even at the expense of solar and wind power. And I think it is to appeal to a voting base, white, working class men who really do feel like the economy has passed them by despite efforts to invest in education, new job training, and so forth. So I think that's an appeal. But I would say, I guess with this question, it depends on how you define what a better economy would look like. Are you talking just about reducing inflation, gas prices, prices of your regular goods and so forth? Are you talking about sustained long-term growth? And what does that economy, that quote-unquote better economy, even look like? That's just me kind of throwing one out to the rest of the panel, because I'm not an economics expert.
I don't think any of us are.
So I think there's kind of I agree with what's been said so far, that there's this kind of differing perspective. I think the tariff issue, this is going to increase the cost of goods, but I don't know that Vice President Harris has presented any clear proposals, right? Even this idea about promoting small businesses, I think every presidential candidate since I've been alive has promoted the idea of small businesses, but what it actually looks like in practice is one, policy-wise difficult because a lot of this stuff is handled at the state level as well. But there's also kind of weird fear-mongering that is also kind of typical that's happened. I saw a Republican strategist on ABC News yesterday, I can't remember her name, but she suggested that Vice President Harris's platform is dangerous because she's advocating for socialist price controls. So you have like the red baiting, but also there is, I mean, on things like insulin and other things, there is some degree to which I think it's capped at $40 now, the Biden administration did, and there's some effort to increase that to, but $40 for a month is still a lot of money for people, so it's, and it's not socialistic, this is in part in industry protection, but it might actually be something, like during periods of intense inflation, price controls are actually a reasonable policy, especially when people, poor working class people are having difficulty affording basic necessities, especially when you have corporate profits on the rise too, which shouldn't be happening. If inflation was being driven by normal economic factors, you would have corporate profits being stagnant or even decreasing as prices go up. But corporate profits are going through the ceiling. So to whatever degree there was organic inflation, there was also a lot of corporate greed. And Vice President Harris has said she wants to go after price gougers, but again, this is something we've heard from politicians before, and there's no really concrete policy. And I suspect there's a lot of Democratic Party donors who are going to be on the target list of people who have engaged in price gouging, people who got those PPP loans during the pandemic. That was basically a giant scam, right? That needs to be investigated. But the question is, what is she actually going to do if she becomes president? And you could ask the same thing about Donald Trump, and I think the answer on his side would be nothing. And the question for Vice President Harris is, what does that specific policy look like, and is there the energy and impetus to actually do it?
Do you have the concept of a plan?
Yes, something beyond a concept of a plan. Yes.
That's what I meant to say. Thank you.
I would just maybe offer a couple of brief points that I'm kind of trying to look at it from the perspective of what I think voters are interested in, and the interesting thing to me is how both candidates have kind of walked back from positions that were themselves quite singular, but and relatively unprecedented in the last, say, 4 to 8 years. Both candidates have kind of moderated on the kind of what we might call post-neoliberal kind of perspectives, right? So, for example, one interesting thing right now, just to pick up on what Brian was saying, Lena Khan, the Federal Trade Commissioner, she's kind of come under for a lot of fire. She's been one of the sort of bright spots of the Biden administration in terms of her willingness to take on big tech, which I think from a voter's perspective, whether they're Republican or Democrat, is not a bad thing. There's a sort of a populist sense, I think, that some of these Silicon Valley companies have become way too big for their britches. They have started to exercise some undue political influence, as well as shaping the basic governance structures of our everyday lives as we're on our devices and things like this, right? So, do we have freedom of speech, this kind of thing? That should private companies have these kinds of decisions? And I think voters think about the economy, they think really about the types of coercive pressures that can come from large players in the economy. Americans themselves are not instinctively socialist people. I think that's been said over and over again, but they do have a sense of economic justice, and they understand very well that coercion doesn't just come from the state. Even libertarians are starting to address this point more and more, I think, in recent writings. So when you see Reid Hoffman, Mark Cuban, and very sort of notable Democratic donors literally on television as, and they are in fact designated, what's the term for someone who's like a second for a proxy? Surrogate, that's the word I was looking for, thank you, my goodness. These are designated official surrogates of the Democratic Party and the Harris campaign, outwardly campaigning against Lena Khan. I mean, that is a remarkable thing. Now, there's money on the table for Trump there if he wants to pick that up, because those are very popular issues, but he hasn't really done a good job at addressing that, I think. If he was actually willing to sort of do the swamp draining that he sort of promised to do before, I think he would be much more aggressively taking up a stance on that.
And I think that gets at and I think though that's because on big tech, and I think you're certainly seeing this with the fact that Trump, of course, is cozying up so closely to Elon Musk, the fact that you've had people like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg donating heavily, as well as on Facebook, its own form of horrifying misinformation spread. It's because they do see a Donald Trump presidency, despite, as Nick correctly pointed out, Democratic donors just going after Khan, despite her doing what I would argue is are good things. But they see, despite that, they still see Trump as their best bet to maintain the monopolies they've developed and to certainly monopolize digital information to the detriment, I believe.
I think that's a
of this
great
country.
point. And when Harris first got the appointment as the candidate, one of the very early messages from her was she was going to take on monopolies in general. That language has been really walked back lately. She was talking about price controls. She was talking about, obviously there was a very strong reaction from the conservative part of the political spectrum on that. But it's interesting that that kind of messaging has diminished from her.
Thank you so much. We reached the 9:40 mark. Thank you so much for all your remarks. Give in one word, what would you describe Trump's and Kamala's plan in one word?
Like, you mean the contrast?
I mean, just maybe the difference, or maybe one single word to describe the plans, the economic plans that both candidates have.
I guess you can start.
Yeah, sure, I'll take this one. I would say
One single word.
wealthy for Trump. That's his focus. No idea for Harris.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a good.
Trump would be protectionist. Harris would be middle class, which I realize is 2 words.
Thank you. Dr. Piercy?
I don't think I would have anything to add to the 2 that are out there already. Middle class is a good one for Harris. Protectionist, yes, I think that's probably the right term.
I think I would use the word populist for both.
Yeah,
Like
that's
the soundbite of like small businesses really just populism, and tariffs is also just really just populism with very different effects. But yeah.
Thank you so much. Now let's get to the next question, or well, the next topic, which is education. The question is, what impact do educational policies and funding disparities have on shaping voter preferences, particularly in the battleground states? Question is open for discussion. Who would like to start?
Well, I'll get the ball rolling. I mean, I suppose one of the implicit arguments in the question is that education makes a difference. And there are a lot of people in the media who talk about things like low information voting these days. I always have a little concern about that myself, and we can have an interesting conversation about this, but just as a sort of an opening position here, I think one of the great things about the United States of America is its tradition of sort of embracing populism. The American Revolution was a very sort of difficult it's not a black or white question. There was obviously some dark sides to it, but one of the great aspects about it, I'm thinking here of like people like Thomas Paine, and his pamphlet on common sense, and just this idea that people can make their own minds up, right? They have the ability to, with good information and good sort of access to material, if the truth is not held from them, they can make good decisions, and they will make good decisions. And that's an article of faith, I think, in the U.S. lowercase c Constitution, as it were. From there, the question is, are voters poorly informed these days? A lot of people will like to claim they are. It's expedient for them to do so sometimes in terms of things like COVID and foreign policy. But actual fact, I think when those arguments don't always bear scrutiny, because when you look close, it's not that they're poorly informed; it's they are informed. It's just they're informed differently. And I think that we should dismiss that so casually as we sometimes do.
I think this also gets back to what you were saying earlier about attempts by people like there's a genuine concern about misinformation, but the saying a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets its pants on was not invented in the social media age, right? This is an old idea, right?
Yeah.
And so this has always been an issue, which is why I think in terms of specific policies that are mostly happening at the state level, but a president can certainly provide leadership on issues of like content bans that we see in places like Florida and Texas, where there's attempts to shape what people are learning and basically requiring false learning things incorrectly, right? Hiding certain uncomfortable truths, those dark spots you were referring to. And I think that also is relevant to discussions about social media regulation, right? And we should be concerned about government regulating and deciding what counts as misinformation, because I think while people on the left might see that and think, oh, we want to prevent like right-wing ideas that promote hate and things like that from spreading, but in truth, when we look at how these types of restrictions actually get applied, in basically every instance, they're applied against the left or just against the truth, and actually do more to promote far right-wing perspectives and kind of normalizing authoritarian policies. Whereas I think people on the left especially, but anyone who just cares about the truth should believe, maybe this is a little bit too naive, but because power is certainly a dynamic here, but the truth, to Nick's earlier point, I think is generally more knowable when presented alongside an untruth, but not always. But again, I think it's something that you would have expected, I think, given the number of states with these types of restrictions, to be more of an issue, but maybe because it's a state level, like a lot of content in K-12 education is determined at the state level. But again, I think it's super, super important that we have a president who's providing good leadership on this, and including skepticism about the government's proper role in regulating content at all.
Yeah.
And no, go ahead.
Okay. So I think one of the things that's very special of the U.S. is like how it's supposed to be in theory very local, and the idea behind that is that, that's like what Nick was saying, that people really do have the ability to choose what they want to learn, and if you give them the ability, they normally make good decisions. But at the same time, we live in a situation in where like that exists. We have like our local school boards, but we also have a centralized like state institution, right? And I find every semester that like when I'm talking to my students about elections and how like women got the right to vote, African Americans got the right to vote, Hispanics got the right to vote, but also like the right to serve in the jury, that they don't know a lot about it, right? And I think that has the problem of like imagining a United States that is not particularly for them, right, for us. And so they go ahead and vote and make decisions with a background in where like their history is missing, right? And like the whole issue of like Hispanic struggle, right? The social movements that were like the thing that got us the vote, right? There was never an instance in where the federal government was like, okay, I'm going to give you the vote. No, like these were decades of process. And
Power concedes nothing without a demand.
Right? Yeah, it never concedes anything, and it's
force at times.
Yes, in fact, most of the times in the U.S. it was with force. And when you tell these things to students, I think it's very important because they need to understand that like these elections that we have every number of years do have like the consequence of backrolling rights or increasing rights. And if our students don't know where we came from, and that's not being provided by the educational system, we really don't have like a place where to position ourselves. Like there's this innate belief among our students that like when the revolution ended in the United States, everyone had the right to vote and everyone was voting. And they have like this imaginary of how the United States began, which I think is kind of problematic of how the United States has just like been built, right?
It's like historical fan fiction.
Yes.
And this is where, and admittedly what you're talking about here, and I've noticed it too, people think that Voting Rights Act of 1965, that's the end of the civil rights movement, and the American civil rights movement, I would argue, is just like the French Revolution, that famous line, was the French Revolution successful? We shall see. Was the American Civil Rights Movement successful? We shall see. But what Carlos, I think, is, I keep thinking it's Charles de Gaulle, but I don't think that's right. But what Carlos, though, admittedly, this is where
It
I
was
have.
Mao.
Yeah,
It was Mao.
it wouldn't surprise me. Either that or Ho Chi Minh, but I think, but this is where, admittedly, I'm a little more cynical about education policy in America, in the sense that, while it is true, in the sense that, number one, I tend to look at the American public, and really this is true for most societies, I think, kind of the way the comedian George Carlin looked at them. One person by themselves, perfectly rational, reasonable person, but for whatever reason, when people start getting into groups, even if it's just two people, something happens. You have things like groupthink. You have, as it gets bigger, you can have a mob mentality. But I think one of the things that you're seeing at the state level, and a lot of the policies that Donald Trump has proposed, abolishing the Department of Education like every president since Reagan has proposed, de facto banning the existence of trans athletes, etc. He is tapping into a profound anti-intellectual strand that has existed in America since, despite Thomas Paine, despite thinkers like that, we have had so many anti-intellectual, Joseph McCarthy, perfect example of that. He made no bones. George Wallace, he was a populist. He was the one that considered college professors ivory tower pinheads who couldn't park a bicycle straight. And maybe he's right, who knows. But the point I'm making is that Trump, I think, with his education policy outlines, is tapping into an anti-intellectual spirit that I think runs even deeper in America than the intellectuals that have made America great and a leading beacon for, the last best hope on earth historically, but we still have that horrible anti-intellectual spirit that Trump is simply making manifest in his policy proposals.
I think one
Do you want
piece.
to say something? And after that, we can all give the closing remarks.
Yeah, just a very, very quick point on the anti-intellectualism. I think one really sort of conspicuous piece of leverage that Biden could have brought to the table was part of his 2020 campaign cycle promise and platform, which is to rescind a huge amount of college debt. And, just seeing as we're talking about education, it's worth mentioning, that went nowhere. They abandoned it, like many of the sort of Build Back Better agenda sort of policies that Biden had, because he did run on a much more economically populist platform than Vice President Harris has run on, and noticeably so. I mean, you can go through them. Of course, a lot of that got defeated in the Senate because of Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, the two errant Democratic senators,
and judges.
who really stood in the way of a lot of this. But the one thing about student debt is the president didn't have to go through the Senate to achieve that. That was one major part of his economic agenda he could have pushed on, and he dropped the ball on that. He backed off.
Actually,
But-
interesting. Oh, you want to say?
Just real quick, though, part of the problem, though, was the Biden administration did propose executive action. The problem is they kept getting struck down by federal courts that were packed with ultra conservatives. So I don't think it's that he didn't push hard enough. I think he just ran to a brick wall, kind of like on immigration, and ultimately just threw up his hands. Now that's still defeatist. Please don't confuse that with excusing Biden, but to be perfectly fair.
Just to viewers at home can look this up. Brianna Joy Gray wrote a number of pieces around that time that clearly showed that there were other legal pathways that Biden could have chosen to get the educational debt forgiveness across the line. He didn't choose those routes. It's not clear why, but there would have been very little the Supreme Court could have done to stop him if he'd chosen those other pathways and routes. It suggests maybe he didn't want it passed in the first place.
Thank you so much. Would you like to give your closing remarks, please?
I think just to tackle the one on funding disparities, I think the United States has always had funding disparities, right? Specifically in education, and these are are just notorious, right? Like how can like just one school district have so much of a difference from another? But I think like we are already in a situation in where if this continues and funding disparities are a thing that just remains without the federal government directly intervening and making sure that all schools have equal funding, we will like effectively create a country of many different countries with very different types of people who think very differently and who will never agree on anything, and it's just going to get worse.
Yeah.
Well, on that optimistic note, the fact that education funding is done basically universally by property taxes creates massive class differences in education, and some activists are pushing with some degree of success to change how those formulas are done in more progressive liberal states. I know there's big debates about this in my home state of Massachusetts, where they're trying to, again, it's even this progressive move is not a total change. It's still property tax, but with some adjustments. And we haven't heard a lot about this recently, but certainly a few years ago, there was this big discussion of teacher shortages. This is certainly something that's a problem in Texas, but there really isn't a teacher shortage. There is a shortage of people who can teach, who are willing to accept a poverty wage to teach. And again, I think this is something that's primarily handled at the state level, but the federal government does provide an important role through the Department of Education and can set certain standards for wages for teachers, and it would also have an economic benefit, right? These are hundreds of thousands of jobs that we could turn from, lower middle class or upper lower class jobs into solid middle class jobs and careers. But that takes presidential leadership, and it takes money that, if that shouldn't be going to, say, like the military or something like that, but should be spent here.
Yes.
I mean, I think you have to start, because I think everyone at this table has gotten it correct, particularly Carlos and Bryant, that we have to start by more equitable funding, however that might be achieved. Although, I would argue the property tax adjustments is the best way to do it. But I would also say, though, it has to come in conjunction, to piggyback off of what Brian said. It's not just the poverty wages, although that's certainly a big part of it. It's also the fact that now you have a legislature, a board of education, both state and local, and all of these astroturfed parents groups just hovering over every single word that's said in the classroom, demanding, you have, of course, that famous story out of California where even though the mom got angry because her kid had to learn the 5 pillars of Islam, it wasn't because of Islamicization. Islamicization? That's not the right word. Thank you, goodness. It was, just part of the history of the Middle East, and that was the reason. But you have that level of ignorance with so many of these parents. And it's not like it's just, those in the trailer parks or something. You're talking about real estate agents, doctors. I was on a panel on another news show with a retired doctor that was just straight, the level of ignorance they had about education policy was indescribable. And in any case, I think that's why, besides the poverty wages, you have a shortage of people that are willing to teach. Who wants that? It's hard enough trying to get the kids to sit in their seats without having to worry about some parent screaming for your head because you assigned that book with 2 male penguins that raised a chick together. Who wants that?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I've got
Thank you so
nothing
much.
to follow that. We'll leave it on the chickens. And the
There you
penguins.
go.
Thank you so much.